Late 1945, and the rumble of a military truck faded into silence on a dusty Texas cattle station. A skeletal figure emerged from the back, a Japanese girl of 15, whose body had withered to just 68 pounds beneath a uniform that swallowed her whole. American ranchers stood frozen near the fence posts, their weathered faces draining of color as she stumbled forward on trembling legs. One man removed his Stetson and pressed it against his chest. Another muttered through clenched teeth, "Good Lord, she looks barely 10 years old." Inside a converted stable now serving as a medical ward, an army medic guided her to a wooden bench and lifted her wrist between his fingers. The bone felt fragile as a sparrow's wing. She offered no resistance, no expression, just vacant eyes fixed on nothing. Her ribcage pressed against translucent skin like fence rails beneath canvas. A rancher near the doorway turned his face toward the wall and swallowed hard. His companions spoke barely above a breath. "They told us these people were demons, but I see no demon here. Just a starving child shaped by someone else's war, walking into a place she believed would destroy her, and now her fate rested entirely with strangers." The vehicle's tailgate dropped with a hollow clang, and ochre dust swirled lazily around the boots of the watching men. Inside the transport, a dozen young women sat motionless, their garments wrinkled and faces carved hollow by endless months of deprivation and terror. None stirred until commanded, and even then they moved with the wariness of creatures uncertain whether freedom or another cage awaited. The final one to emerge was the smallest among them. She descended without shoes, having lost them somewhere between the bombed ruins of Nagasaki and the docks of San Francisco. Her bare soles met scorching earth as though disconnected from her body. Her gaze swept the horizon searching for razor wire. There was none, only long-horn cattle, quarter horses, towering stacks of hay bales, and a scattering of American cattlemen, with rifles dangling casually from their shoulders. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly. The breeze carried scents of perspiration, tanned hide, and livestock. For a suspended moment, nothing stirred. The ranchers, leathery men with sun-creased faces and tobacco-stained fingers, simply observed the girls stepping down like phantoms from a maritime disaster. The 15-year-old's frame was nothing but angles, her cheekbones jutting sharply, her skin stretched over bone like parchment wrapped around bamboo poles. One man exhaled slowly and whispered to himself alone, "Good grief, she's nothing but a child." Another turned and spat into the dust. Whatever they had been conditioned to expect about enemy prisoners, saboteurs, infiltrators, zealots, this defied every expectation. This was something altogether different. She remained expressionless as they arranged her in line. Her face revealed nothing, not through trained composure, but through emptiness. Her eyes had retreated inward, her lips compressed to a thin seam, her shoulders too narrow to sustain even the concept of resistance. When a rancher stepped forward to verify names, she comprehended nothing of his words, but recognized instantly the cadence of authority. Her hands twitched involuntarily to her sides. "Stand rigid. Remain silent. Persist." Another Japanese woman, with rudimentary English, translated her identity. "She is called Kiomi," the woman announced. The cattleman scrawled it on his ledger with a confused expression, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. "Say that once more." But Kiomi offered nothing. They escorted her to an adjacent barn where the military physician had established a crude infirmary consisting of a canvas cot, a weighing apparatus, and a dented metal table bearing bandages, antiseptic solution, and spectacles resting on an open registry. The medic, a young man with peeling ears and unwavering hands, beckoned her to sit. Kiomi complied without sound. He crouched beside her, carefully drawing back her tattered sleeve. Her arm seemed ready to fracture under its own weight. He located her pulse point with practiced fingers. The rhythm was sluggish, dangerously sluggish. He raised his eyes to the rancher positioned behind him. "She cannot weigh more than 68 pounds, he said quietly. The cattleman cursed beneath his breath and clutched his hat. "That is not a soldier," he declared. "That is a skeleton wrapped in cloth." The physician traced his palm gently across her ribcage, tallying silently. Every bone stood prominent. Her midsection appeared concave. There were contusions, ancient ones healed into peculiar patterns, and her legs quivered despite sitting still. He extended a cup of water toward her. She remained motionless. He lifted it to her lips, and she consumed it as though tasting something forbidden. Her expression never altered, not the slightest tremor, merely mechanical swallowing. "I have witnessed newborn calves emerge from harsh winters looking healthier," another rancher observed, softer than intended. They could not determine which disturbed them more profoundly, her absolute silence or her complete absence of fear. She appeared conditioned to this, accustomed to examination, measurement, manipulation, dismissal. The cattleman holding the ledger cleared his throat and inscribed 15 beside her name. Though even that seemed to warrant uncertainty, the barn structure groaned. A horse shuffled in the neighboring stall. Beyond the walls, the sun descended behind distant ridgelines, casting elongated shadows across the corral. Within that space, the atmosphere thickened with something none could articulate. It was not compassion, not yet. It was the initial glimmer of recognition that this girl, this minuscule, fragile girl, bore no resemblance to what wartime propaganda had assured them. She posed no threat. She had been shattered. And within the weight of that understanding, something fundamental in the room transformed. The physician draped a woolen cover across her shoulders. It engulfed her completely. She made no protest. He exchanged glances with the rancher still clutching his hat as though it were a banner lowered. "In grief, we lack the resources for this situation," he stated quietly. The cattleman simply nodded. "Then we create them." Before she encountered a single rancher or witnessed the crimson soil of Texas, Kiomi had mastered the art of disappearing, not through sorcery or stealth but through stillness. It was wartime Japan, where silence meant survival. Her dwelling was a partially demolished timber structure at the outskirts of Nagoya, where rooftops were reinforced with salvaged tarps and windows sealed with newsprint. Her father had perished aboard a supply vessel 3 years into the conflict. Her mother rendered weeds into evening broth. Her elder brother Satoshi enlisted in the imperial forces, and when he departed, he never glanced backward. That image remained her final glimpse of him. When incendiary bombs descended, streaming trails of white fire, she burrowed into a drainage ditch behind a neighbor's poultry enclosure and observed the heavens transform to blazing amber. Subsequently, the atmosphere perpetually carried the odor of incinerated paper. At 13, she was conscripted as a Taishan Tai, a patriotic volunteer supporting military operations. The designation suggested nobility and sacrifice, but the reality meant scouring floors, folding blood-saturated linens, and hauling metal containers of water to burdensome for her slight frame. Through hospital passageways, she witnessed adolescent boys, no older than Satoshi, hemorrhaging silently into oblivion. The nurses, their expressions vacant, repeated identical phrases to every weeping girl. "Endure for the sovereign," she uttered. Nothing in response. Weeping had abandoned her months prior. Military instructors distributed compressed ration blocks and doctrine pamphlets with equal frequency. They instructed the girls on dying with honor, but never imparted survival techniques. Capitulation. They emphasized surpassed death in disgrace, should Americans seize them. Continued existence would bring eternal regret. Leaflets dropped by. American aircraft proclaimed otherwise, but nobody trusted foreign paper. Officers incinerated those messages without examination. You shall be violated. One commander cautioned, his eyes flat as river stones. They shall strip your dignity, your garments, your spirit. Better to sever your own tongue than submit. To capture. Kiomi acknowledged this solemnly. In that moment, she embraced every syllable. She retained the illustrations displayed during preparedness exercises. A kneeling young woman surrounded by captors, her eyes extinguished by humiliation. The implication was unmistakable. Survival meant permanent dishonor. However, during August of that year, the atmosphere itself transformed. The medical facility descended into stillness. Officers ceased their bellowing. Subsequently came the directive. Withdraw immediately. No ceremony. No clarification. A nurse sobbed quietly in the corner. Someone had intercepted a transmission. On a concealed radio, Japan had capitulated. The empire lay fractured. The emperor himself had addressed the populace through broadcast. An occurrence none believed conceivable. His voice, thin and otherworldly, instructed them to tolerate the intolerable. Nobody stirred. Momentarily, even duration appeared suspended. Kiomi arranged her blood-stained apron neatly, positioned it upon a cot, and departed barefoot. She was herded onto transport vehicles the following dawn alongside others resembling her. Young women raised amid bomb craters whose hands understood stretcher weight, but never mattress comfort. They maintained silence throughout the coastal journey. Some wept, others stared vacantly ahead. Several attempted flight, but guards withheld gunfire. Escape led nowhere. Upon reaching the harbor, American Marines awaited them, bearing not whips but administrative forms. The incongruity bewildered everyone. They were transferred onto a vessel bound for America. It was no prison hulk. It contained genuine sleeping quarters, meal trays, cleansing products. Kiomi remained below deck predominantly. The ocean rendered her ill. The motion, the odor, the unnatural quietude of the cargo hold blurred into waking hallucination. She consumed what they provided, but never emptied her portion. Not from satiation, but because completion would render this genuine. She observed fellow girls sleeping with spines pressed against bulkheads, still anticipating violence that never materialized. Each day dissolved in peculiar stillness. Warfare receding behind them like vapor across water. One girl murmured that America contained crystalline towers alongside torture chambers. Another claimed prisoners became animal fodder. Kiomi contributed nothing. She merely clutched her cot's edge and counted ceiling rivets, awaiting the nightmare's commencement. But nightmares never materialized. Days accumulated into weeks. The vessel decelerated, ultimately docking, not in dungeons, but at a harbor where sunlight cascaded across iron railings. And sentries squinted beneath hat brims like agriculturalists during harvest season. She descended the gangway onto American territory and detected hay instead of artillery. Smoke. Horses whinnied distantly, and somewhere across Texas pastures, someone strummed a banjo. Nothing corresponded to expectation. Nothing whatsoever. Yet she advanced forward because no alternative destination remained. The barn entrance groaned as it sealed behind her, and Kiomi stood motionless momentarily, uncertain whether to proceed or withdraw. A sentry. No, not a sentry. A cattleman offered an acknowledging nod and indicated a corner where simple sleeping arrangements had been prepared. It amounted to a hay mound with a wool blanket arranged neatly atop. Yet it was sanitary. She approached gradually, her footsteps hesitant, every movement uncertain. Her vision swept the environment. A compact heating stove flickered with amber flame, projecting dancing shadows across timber. Walls, a horseshoe suspended above the entrance, and from the adjacent compartment emerged the measured, rhythmic respiration of a slumbering bovine. She lowered herself onto the hay, anticipating abrasion or discomfort, but encountered neither. It was yielding, temperate even. She seized the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders like protective armor. The fibers grazed her skin, and she recoiled, not from pain, but from its absence. It was the first gentle contact she had experienced in months, perhaps years. She reclined, observed the overhead rafters, and listened. No trampling footsteps, no bellowed commands, no lamentation, merely the gentle crackling of burning timber and muted sounds of creatures settling for the evening. The aromas were unfamiliar. Earth, leather, wood smoke. Not the recognizable stench of medical antiseptic and decomposing bandages. Not the bitter atmosphere of demolished urban centers. This was purer, more organic. It confounded her comprehension. Her physique remained rigid, taut beneath the covering, as though it would be confiscated instantaneously. She achieved no sleep. She had forgotten the mechanism entirely. Sometime during darkness, the barn entrance groaned once more. She bolted upright. A figure entered. A cattleman wearing a sun-bleached crimson kerchief around his throat and bearing a tin vessel. He avoided rapid approach. Instead, he crouched beside the heating apparatus, stirred something within a pot, then transferred it into the container. Vapor ascended in spirals. He approached her deliberately, avoiding direct eye contact, and extended the vessel. She remained frozen. Stew, he pronounced gently. The terminology meant nothing to her, but the fragrance communicated everything. She examined it as one might scrutinize a snare. It was murky, oleaginous. Vegetable segments floated beside meat. Fragments. The aroma penetrated her defenses like artillery. Onions, beef, broth, rendered fat. Her stomach constricted, not from revulsion, but from sudden ravenous craving. Nevertheless, she refused to reach forward. She had been instructed that sustenance from adversaries signified contamination, signified degradation. The man positioned the container on the ground beside her and retreated, nodding once before returning to the heating apparatus. She observed the vessel as though it might evaporate. Gradually, cautiously, she retrieved it. The metal radiated, warmth against her palms. She raised it toward her lips, hesitating just before broth contacted her mouth. Then she consumed it. The temperature struck her tongue like flame. Salt, oil, something sweet, something astringent. Her body convulsed with surprise, and she nearly released the container. But she maintained her grip. She consumed another mouthful, then another. Her vision blurred, not from seasoning, but from something more profound, something ancient and interred. She was not merely experiencing nourishment. She was experiencing recollection of summer rice portions, of her mother's fermented soybean soup before scarcity commenced, of the final occasion her stomach recognized abundance rather than vacancy. She wiped her mouth with her hands reverse, sighed. The cattleman offered no commentary. He simply remained near the heating apparatus, carving a timber fragment. His presence was tranquil, neither menacing nor inquisitive, merely present, as though she were not an adversary, but simply a girl. She could not comprehend this. Previously, being observed meant peril. Being vulnerable meant condemnation. Yet here, within a barn fragrant with hay and broth, someone had provided sustenance and departed. Not to surveil her, not to interrogate her, merely to nourish her. And that gesture, exceeding the stew, exceeding the blanket, disrupted her foundations. Entirely, she deposited the emptied container and curled beneath the covering. Her fingers clutched the border, knuckles blanched. Somewhere profound within her chest, something minuscule shifted. Not confidence, not yet, but the initial delicate fracture in the armor she had been commanded to maintain until death. In the adjacent compartment, the bovine released a deep, resonant exhalation, and for the first occasion in considerable duration, Kiomi permitted her eyes to close. Upon awakening, the blanket remained present. That constituted the initial surprise. It had not been confiscated during darkness, had not been exchanged for something inferior, coarser, less hers. She arose gradually, her muscles protesting from the unfamiliar stillness of genuine slumber, and drew the wool more securely around her shoulders. The material still retained her body's warmth, and in that instant, recognition settled upon her like dawn frost. This blanket belonged to her, not borrowed, not taken, not provisional. It had been bestowed upon her. She clutched it like prohibited goods, partially anticipating someone to tear it away and denounce her as a thief. But nobody arrived. No shouting, no retribution, merely boot sounds outside the barn and distant animal vocalizations. Upon a small wooden crate beside her sleeping arrangements and a tin basin containing a cloth and a soap bar. Adjacent to it lay a fresh pair of stockings. She examined them as though they were religious artifacts. These were not mere objects. They were emblems of consideration, of value, of being acknowledged. Previously, she had learned to anticipate. Nothing permanent. Her footwear had originally belonged to her brother. Her grooming comb had fractured teeth. Her ration documentation misspelled her name. And nobody ever bothered with correction. But here, every article, every modest ordinary object carried revolutionary significance. A dental brush, a drinking cup, a comb with complete teeth. They were unspoken proclamations. You merit this effort. That concept terrified her more profoundly than any armament. Later that morning, the barn entrance opened with a creak, and one of the ranch laborers entered. He was more aged than the others, with an uneven gait in his left leg and a countenance appearing carved from sun-hardened timber. He spoke minimally, merely providing her a small burlap container filled with grain and gesturing toward the poultry enclosure. Initially she failed to comprehend. She blinked, perplexed. Surely this was mistaken. She was the captive, the adversary. Why would they entrust her with anything possessing life? But he simply smiled, partial smile, more apparent in his eyes than mouth, and indicated again. She followed. The enclosure was warm and fragrant with straw, feathers, and faintly eggs. The poultry clucked as she entered, their heads pivoting toward her with curiosity rather than alarm. She knelt, opened the container, and distributed the grain. They surged toward her in a feathered commotion. Initially she recoiled, but they neither pecked nor attacked. They simply consumed, satisfied in their routine. She settled onto her heels and observed, the rhythm of it peculiar yet calming. It reminded her of days preceding the incendiary attacks, when her mother maintained to hens behind their residence. She recalled her mother's voice summoning them at dusk, and how she would tenderly nestle the eggs into her apron like precious items. The recollections caused pain, but differently than before. This pain was more subdued, more like reverberation. The poultry pecked and paraded around her, unconcerned with conflicts or philosophies. They cared not that she was Japanese or female or a prisoner. They simply acknowledged her. By the week's conclusion, the ranch laborer demonstrated egg collection, then enclosure maintenance. The labor was never compelled. He issued no harsh commands. He simply demonstrated, nodded, and left her to proceed. She discovered that the enclosure's silence, interrupted only by clucks and the gentle flutter of wings, was more bearable than the barn's silence. It provided her hands with occupation, her mind a resting place. The fractures in her armor expanded. Previously, kindness was tactical, a calculated display of allegiance to superiors. Here it was quieter, unannounced, a soap bar, a stew bowl, a task implying confidence, and that confidence began to dismantle her. That evening she sat on her hay-mound bed, clutching the blanket again, but this time not from fear of confiscation, but because it had acquired significance. It was not merely insulation against cold. It was evidence that she existed beyond utility, that someone believed she deserved warmth. She folded it over her legs carefully, almost reverently. Then she reached for the comb, drawing it through her tangled hair with slow, deliberate motions. Each stroke, each movement was like a quiet whisper to herself, "You persist." And somewhere, deep inside, the question stirred again. One she could not yet vocalize. Why would the adversary treat me this way if they were the monsters I was told they were? That question still resonated in her consciousness as nightfall pressed inward. The barn quiet except for the shuffle of creatures settling into rest. But then something novel disrupted the stillness, faint initially, like wind dragging across wire, then stronger, plucking a banjo. She sat upright. The notes bounded with a rhythm she could not interpret, too rapid, too jubilant, like dialogue between children who had never experienced bombardment. A harmonica joined, reedy and luminous. Then came laughter, unreserved, unconstrained, from men who were not concealing in fortifications or whispering beneath air raid sirens. It was not the laughter of insanity or resentment. It was the variety she remembered from long ago when her brother would pursue her through the rice fields. It struck her like a blow. She drew the blanket tighter and stared at the barn's wooden slats. The music persisted. The banjo strummed onward, loosening something. Within her chest, she recognized not the melody. She could not reproduce it, but it remained with her, an uninvited visitor curling beside her heart. She detested it, yet she desired it to continue. The following morning, the aroma reached her before her eyes opened. It curled into the barn, like a specter, briny, oleaginous, dense. Her stomach growled before her thoughts could orient. She rose slowly and blinked. One of the younger ranch hands stood in the doorway with a tray. Upon it rested eggs, bread, and two strips of something dark and sizzling. "Bacon," he announced, offering the plate like an apology. She received it with both hands, fingers trembling. The bacon glistened in the light. Its edges curled like waves. Previously, meat had become mythology, discussed but never witnessed. Her mother once purchased a single fish head from illegal markets and boiled it for 2 days to create broth. The fragrance of this, of fat and fire, was overwhelming. She stared at it, immobilized. The bread was warm. The eggs quivered slightly, but it was the bacon that stole her breath. She raised it toward her mouth and hesitated. Her hands trembled so severely she nearly dropped the tray. Then she bit. The crunch resonated in her skull. Salt detonated on her tongue. Grease slid across her lips. Her throat constricted, not from revulsion, but from recollection. Starving neighbors. Her mother's hollowed cheeks. A child weeping in the adjacent room because the rice was exhausted. The bacon felt improper, too abundant, too rich, too genuine. Her vision blurred. She retched. The ranch hand stepped forward, alarmed, but she waved him away and compelled herself to swallow. Her body did not reject it. Her mind did. But then she consumed another portion. Because hunger does not request permission, she ate in silence, chewing slowly, each bite an act of betrayal and survival simultaneously. The bread was soft, the eggs buttery, the bacon still excessive, but she finished everything. She wiped her mouth with the cloth napkin, then folded it in half as she had observed the others do. She looked upward. The cattleman had departed. Only the empty tray remained on the crate beside her, like an offering from a world that still defied comprehension. Outside, the banjo commenced again, faint, playful. She pressed her palm heel to her chest, attempting to steady her heartbeat. The laughter returned as well, outside the barn, drifting in like pollen. She detested that it made her wonder what provoked their amusement. Detested that she wanted to know. She had matured in silence, in the shadow of whispers, warnings, and war drums. Joy had always been distant, something rationed and rare. Here, it spilled out randomly, uninvited, uncontrolled. It felt dangerous. It felt alive. She did not laugh, not yet, but she did not cover her ears. Later that week, while she was folding the washed ivory-colored cloths by the water pump, a uniformed man approached her. Not a cattleman this time, a sergeant. His boots were polished, his expression unreadable behind the lines that seemed carved into his face like dried riverbeds. In his hand, he held something small. When he stopped before her, he did not speak immediately, just extended the item. It was a yellow pencil, short and dulled at the tip, with a paper scrap folded beneath it. "Write home," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away. Kiomi stood there unmoving, the pencil in her fingers like it might ignite. Her mind reeled. Write home? Was this an examination, a snare? No one declared this was permitted. Previously, the last letter she received from her mother was scribbled on rice paper delivered through military channels and censored into near incoherence. Now she was being provided opportunity to respond. She stared at the paper like it was an indecipherable map. Her thumb brushed the fiber grain, the soft edge of the pencil wood. Her heart pounded with the rhythm of the question. What could I possibly say? That she was alive. That the Americans, the adversaries, the demons, the monsters in propaganda posters, had provided her eggs and bacon, a toothbrush, a blanket. Would her mother even believe it? The blank space before her felt like betrayal. Every line she might compose seemed like confession. I am here. I am not deceased. I am not being tortured. I am warm. Every truth was a contradiction. The concept of writing them down made her stomach clench. She sat on the crate outside the barn, pencil hovering above the page. She wanted to write her mother's name, but her hand would not move. Not yet. Previously, she had been taught that silence was patriotism, that words were dangerous unless they served the emperor, that communication could betray the state, the family, the self. To write to her mother now would be to acknowledge that her world had already crumbled, that her commanders were mistaken. That surrender was not death but something stranger, a life she did not comprehend. She thought of the other girls on the vessel, some younger, some older, how they kept their eyes lowered, their mouths sealed. What would they write if given the opportunity? Would they tell the truth? Would they even remember how? Kiomi lowered the pencil to the paper. Her handwriting was rigid, clumsy, her fingers out of practice. She began a sentence, then scratched it out, started another, stopped halfway. The sun slipped lower in the sky, casting long orange shadows across the dirt. The banjo again plucked something soft in the distance. Her stomach tightened. Then finally, she wrote 2 words. I'm safe. That was all. No name, no address, no explanation, just 2 words. Because that was the most radical truth she could offer. She folded the paper, walked to the sergeant's office, and placed it on the desk without a word. He looked up, nodded once, and reached for the envelope. As she stepped outside, something shifted. The air smelled like sage and horses. In the barn, the chickens were quiet. She realized slowly, deeply, that she no longer expected the bomb. Sirens. She had not imagined a guard's boot in over a week. Her jaw, usually clenched during sleep, had begun to loosen. The war for her was no longer present tense. It was a memory, a shadow, still loud, still close, but behind her, and in its place, a whisper of something new. Not trust, not forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of belief that this strange land with its pencils and pork and plucking strings was not hell. It might not be home, but it was no longer the battlefield. The next day, a different kind of summons came. One of the older women, a nurse from Osaka, whispered the news as if it were sacred. There would be a bath, hot water, real soap. Kiyomi's first reaction was not joy. It was suspicion. Was this a deception? Hot water was something spoken of in past tense, before the shortages, before the hospital had no heating, before the lice made even touching your own hair a kind of war. She followed the others quietly to the barn's far end, where large galvanized tubs had been arranged in rows, each filled with water warmed over wood stoves. The rising steam was hypnotic, curling in the cold morning air like incense. A wooden crate held folded towels, cloths, and bars of thick yellow soap, coarse, square, and impossibly fragrant. Kiomi reached for one and stopped, her fingers hovering over it like it might evaporate beneath her touch. She picked it up. It did not vanish. The fragrance struck her first. Lemon, no. Something richer. She could not name it, but it made her dizzy. She sat at the tub's edge, dipped a cloth into the water, and watched the soap lather into a froth of white bubbles. She had not seen lava in years. Not genuine lava, not the kind that promised to remove not just grime, but memory. One of the women sobbed quietly beside her, rubbing her arms repeatedly with the cloth as if she could erase the war from her skin. Another closed her eyes as she dunked her hair beneath the water, and emerged gasping, not from heat, but from something deeper. Resurrection. That is what it felt like. Kiomi bathed slowly, carefully, each part of her body rediscovered beneath the suds. She had forgotten what it meant to feel clean. Not merely not dirty, but clean. Her own scent returned faint beneath the soap, familiar and startling. She ran, the cloth over the backs of her ears, her neck, her arms. They were thinner than she remembered, but they remained hers. When the final tubs had gone cool, they dried themselves and dressed again in their borrowed clothing. The towels were stiff, the fabric strange, but no one complained. For the first time, they looked at one another not as shadows or statistics, but as women. Someone borrowed a mirror from the mess hall and passed it around. They stared at themselves, not in vanity, but in disbelief. Someone had managed to acquire a tin of red lipstick, smuggled, gifted. No one knew. It made its way down the line like contraband, passed from hand to hand. Kiomi did not apply it, but she held it. That alone was sufficient, a color from a world she had forgotten. Then came the sound of boots outside the barn. Cattlemen, two of them leaning against the doorframe, peeking in, not leering, not mocking, just curious. One tipped his hat and said something in English too rapid to comprehend. The older women stiffened. Kiomi tensed. But then he lifted a ridiculous, oversized saloon-style hat from his head, placed it on the other cattleman, and both burst into laughter. The younger one stumbled backward, pretending to dance with an invisible partner, tripping over his own boots. The sound was honest, harmless. It did not pierce like gunfire. It filled the barn with something disarming. Some of the women chuckled, quiet initially, then louder. Not one of them had heard that sound in months. The cattleman walked off, still laughing, never glancing back. No threat. Just two boys playing with time in a world no longer at war. Kiomi stared at the leftover, soap in her palm. It was melting now, soft around the edges, but it had not disappeared. Neither had she. That evening, a fire was lit just beyond the barn, its glow stretching long fingers across the dirt as dusk settled over the ranch. The air cooled quickly, carrying with it the smell of smoke and dry grass. Kiomi sat with the other girls in a loose circle, their blankets wrapped tight around their shoulders. The fire crackled steady and alive, and for once no one was counting minutes or watching shadows. The cattlemen sat a short distance away, not crowding them, not guarding them, just sharing the same night. One of the younger men shuffled a deck of cards, the worn edges whispering against each other. He crouched near Kiomi and held up a card, speaking slowly. "This is King." He tapped the face, then handed it to her. She stared at it, unsure, then nodded. "Another card, Queen." She repeated the word softly, testing it. The others watched, some smiling, some still cautious. The game unfolded clumsily, rules explained through gestures and broken phrases. But it did not matter. Winning was not the point. Sitting together was. At some point someone produced a harmonica. It was small, scratched, clearly beloved. The cattleman held it out to Kiomi without ceremony. She hesitated. Instruments previously were reserved for ceremonies, for controlled moments. This felt informal, dangerous, but she accepted it. Her fingers wrapped around the cool metal. She brought it to her lips and blew. The sound that emerged was sharp and wrong. The group burst into laughter, not mocking, just surprised. She tried again. Another sour note. More laughter, and then, without warning, she laughed too. It escaped her before she could stop it. Light and startled, as if it did not belong to her. The sound hung in the air momentarily, fragile and unreal. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide. The others stared. Then one of the women laughed as well. Then another. The firelight danced across their faces as the sound grew, layering over itself, shaky initially, then stronger. Kiyomi's chest tightened. Guilt surged fast and hot. How could she laugh when her mother might still be hungry? When her brother was likely dead? When cities lay in ash across the ocean? The laugh caught in her throat and died away. But the cattlemen did not stop smiling. They did not hush her. No one told her to be quiet. No one punished joy. That was when the question rose, uninvited and unstoppable. If the adversary valued her life enough to teach her a game, to hand her music, to laugh with her instead of at her, why had her own country treated her as disposable? The thought felt dangerous, treasonous, but it would not depart. She looked around the circle. These girls had been told the same thing she had, that they were implements, that suffering was proof of allegiance, that death was preferable to capture. And yet here they sat, fed, warm, learning words in another language, laughing by a fire lit by men they had been trained to hate. One of the older women spoke softly in Japanese, almost to herself. "They see us." No one argued. Kiomi met the eyes of the cattleman across the fire. He did not look away. There was no triumph in his gaze, no hunger, just recognition, as if he was seeing a person, not a uniform. She lowered her eyes first, her heart pounding. That simple exchange unsettled her more than any shouted command ever had. The harmonica made its way back around the circle, this time producing something closer to a tune. Someone clapped, someone else hummed. The fire popped and shifted. For a brief stretch of time, the war loosened its grip. But the reckoning lingered. If dignity could be offered so easily by strangers, what had been stolen from them by those who claimed to protect them? Kiomi pulled her blanket tighter and stared into the flames. The fire did not judge, it just burned. She did not know the answer yet. She only knew that once the question had been asked, it could never be unasked. Thousands of miles away, across the Pacific and deep within the grey corridors of a Tokyo military intelligence office, a clerk unfolded a letter. The paper was thin, the ink smudged slightly, and it had passed through many hands. It had been flagged, intercepted, a letter written by a former field assistant, now a prisoner allegedly held in Texas of all places. The note was brief, carefully chosen words in a girl's handwriting. It said little, but it said everything. "I'm safe." That was all. To the Americans, it had seemed like a simple message home. To the Japanese authorities, it was a warning bell. The letter had passed the censors in the States, but not in the broken remains of the Japanese military chain of command, where paranoia still lingered like smoke. That two-word sentence contradicted everything the empire had taught. According to the official narrative, American camps were savage and merciless. Surrender was not survival. It was death of honor. But here was a girl alive, safe, writing with her own hand. The contents were quietly shared among intelligence officials. Some scoffed. Others frowned. A few said nothing at all. What disturbed the most was not what the letter said. It was what it did not say. No complaints, no hunger, no cruelty, no broken bones, just safety, just survival. The silence between the lines screamed louder than any accusation. Back in Texas, Kiomi had no idea her letter had traveled so far or caused such ripples. She had returned to her daily routines, gathering eggs, feeding chickens, sweeping hay. But something inside her had shifted. A small invisible revolution had taken place. One morning while walking past the ranch house, she heard the slam of a screen door and turned to see a small girl, maybe 8 or 9, bounding down the steps, her braid flying. In her hand she held a thin piece of fabric, pink, bright, alive, a ribbon. She ran up to Kiomi without hesitation and held it out. "For you," she said in English, grinning before skipping off toward the paddock. Kiomi held the ribbon like it was gold. She did not know what to do initially. Wear it? Keep it hidden? What did it mean to accept something that had once been unthinkable? That evening, she tied it into her hair, just above her ear, neat and small. The reaction was immediate. Some of the women gasped. A few turned away. One whispered that it was shameful, but no one said it to her face. They could not, because they had seen her change slowly, quietly, openly. The ribbon was more than decoration. It was defiance, not against Japan, but against what Japan had told her to be. Against the idea that she was only a function, a servant to war, a body to be used and discarded. She looked into the mirror briefly and saw not a soldier, not a burden, not a tool, but a girl. That night she walked through the barn and past a group of Americans playing cards. One looked up and tipped his hat. No comment, no mockery, just a glance of recognition. She nodded back and kept walking because she was not performing. She was not pretending. She was becoming, slowly, day by day, reclaiming her own shape with a pencil, with soap, with a ribbon, and somewhere in a government office across the sea. Her quiet rebellion had already landed like a stone in still water. They had read her letter in Tokyo, but they would never understand the weight behind those two small words. Not unless they had stood barefoot in a barn with warm food in their stomach and music in the air, and realized for the first time they were allowed to live, to feel, to become, to be. The notice came quietly, pinned to the board outside the mess hall in plain English and careful Japanese. Repatriation. The word looked unreal, like it belonged to another life. Kiomi stood before it with her hands folded, reading it again and again until the letters settled into meaning. She would be going home, not back to the girl she had been, not back to the world that had burned and starved her, but back to a country changed beyond recognition. And she would not be the same either. On the morning of departure, the medic weighed her one last time. He checked the scale twice, then smiled to himself. 100 pounds. He wrote it down neatly, as if recording a quiet victory, when she had arrived. She had weighed 68. The number itself had been a shock, a fact too stark to argue with. Now the difference showed everywhere, in her cheeks, in the steadiness. of her walk, in the way she met people's eyes without flinching. The war had not been kind to her body, but it had not taken everything. She was issued a new coat, heavy and warm, the fabric smelling faintly of soap and storage. A pair of glasses followed, fitted carefully by the medic after she admitted she had not seen clearly in years. The world sharpened instantly. Edges appeared where there had only been blur. Faces became distinct. She blinked hard, overwhelmed by the clarity. No one should have to live in a blur. The medic said gently, repeating words he had used before. She nodded, understanding more than the language allowed. In her small bundle, she packed the things that had become hers, the diary filled with uneven handwriting. The ribbon now faded from sun and washing, the pencil worn almost to nothing, enfolded carefully into the inside pocket of her coat. A letter. It was short, written by one of the cattlemen in awkward, careful words. He wished her well. He said he hoped she would remember Texas kindly. He signed his name and added almost as an afterthought, "You're tougher than you look." She boarded the truck with the others as the sun crested the horizon. The ranch stood quiet behind them, fences stretching out into the distance, cattle lowing softly, as if unaware that anything was ending. The cattlemen lined up near the gate. No speeches, no salutes, just hats tipped low, one by one. Kiomi paused, turned, and bowed her head once. It was not submission. It was acknowledgement. Then she climbed into the truck and did not look back. The ship that carried her home was larger than the one that had brought her across the ocean. But it felt different, lighter. She stood on deck as the coastline faded, the wind tugging at her coat, and opened her diary. She read entries she barely remembered writing. Observations, confessions, questions. One line stopped her breath. "I do not understand this war anymore." She closed the book slowly. She did not tear the page out. She did not cross the sentence away. It was true, and perhaps it always would be. The voyage back was quieter than the first. There was no dread coiled in her stomach, no waiting for cruelty to arrive. Instead, there was a hollow space filled with thought. What would Japan look like now? Would her mother still be alive? Would there be food? Would there be room for a girl who had been fed and sheltered by the adversary? She did not know, but she knew she would walk onto that shore standing upright. When the ship finally docked, the port was scarred and subdued. Buildings leaned like tired men. Faces were thin. The air carried the weight of loss. As she stepped onto Japanese soil, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet. She touched the ribbon in her hair, then the diary in her coat. These things anchored her. They reminded her that dignity was not something a nation could grant or take away. She blended into the crowd, another survivor among many, carrying no banner, no answers, only memory. She would never forget the ranch, the barn that was warm, the banjo strings in the night, the bacon she had gagged on and eaten anyway, the pencil, the soap, the laughter that had felt like rebellion. She had arrived at the ranch weighing 68 pounds, barely more than a shadow. She left weighing 102, carrying something far heavier than flesh. She carried the knowledge that even in war, humanity could survive.